Hey there, what's up? I'm Anthony Tresca, and welcome to this episode of Spooky Scraps, where we take a horror property, find something weird or obscure about it, and then we talk about that. Joining me today to talk about Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, is Dr. Katherine Troyer.
Yay! I'm so excited to talk about this documentary, especially in light of our discussion of the episode, right? Because there was so much that we couldn't talk about, and I think one of them is this documentary.
This documentary, Mark Patton's life, like him as an individual, because we got to talk about his performance, but that's not the same thing as talking about a dude's life and getting to learn about them, and frankly, just the making of a film. So yeah, it's always fun to get to look at these documentaries and behind-the-scenes stuff like that.
And what makes Scream Queen so interesting is that it raises all of these questions about, to me at least, about like, what is a documentary? What is a documentary's goal? And I know it's really easy to just kind of think of a documentary as like being about providing information, and that's true, but it's also about making an argument, right? And providing information based on a very specific thesis, if you will. And there is a very clear thesis in Scream Queen.
Yeah, and I think honestly that thesis, the argument of this documentary, is my biggest problem with this documentary, because the thesis is basically Mark Patton, wronged by writer David Chaskin, needs an apology.
And the most unsatisfying part was that apology by Chaskin.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's something that you feel that I shouldn't have done. I don't know. I'm not going to say I haven't made mistakes. I'm not going to say I haven't said things that I've regretted. But
Me too.
You know, I hope you can forgive me for any perceived it wasn't intentional. Certainly, I don't want to promote homophobia, but I do want to point it out.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you. And that was the only thing that I wanted.
It was this super weird, like, where he was like, I'm sorry if you're upset about the fact that I'm upset, right? Like, it was this, and it was like, what are you saying?
And he was both justifying the homophobia present in the film, but also denying that there was any homophobia at all present in the film. It was an embarrassing moment, and it really left a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah, for me too, and I think you could get the impression that was true for everyone, right? You know, there was that sort of like moment where it's like, good, the apology has been had, but again, it was an apology that was very clearly, I'm sorry that you feel bad, not I'm sorry that I played a role in this darkness.
And you know what I think is the most frustrating part about this documentary is that they had the perfect subject to make a documentary about. Mark Patton is right there. But instead of like making this a documentary about Mark Patton's life, his activism, the 20 years that he spent in Mexico, any of that, it just focuses on this kind of rivalry that happened in the making of Nightmare.
And having never been systematically removed from Hollywood, right? I can't attest to how salty I would be, but I can imagine it would be pretty salty. So I can understand how Patton, needed that closure, and I was okay with that being a theme, but I think you're absolutely correct that the most interesting parts, the way that he's claimed this identity, his activism, his like really wonderful sounding life in Mexico, these were things that I think we all would have appreciated hearing more about, because it would have, I think, better aligned with part of the message, which is that, it is difficult to be gay. It is difficult to be queer. It is particularly difficult to be these things in horror, but it is also possible to reclaim one's voice. And I think that got a little lost, surprisingly enough, in a documentary that was in theory all about Patton claiming his voice.
Yeah, and I think another problem is that this film really just fundamentally didn't really need to be about Mark Patton and his experience in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, because there's already another documentary out there that covers the same subject, and it's actually mentioned in this documentary. It's called Never Sleep Again, The Elm Street Legacy. It's from 2010. It's the thing that they mentioned in this that got Mark Patton to come out of retirement, and that that 30-minute segment in there on Nightmare on Elm Street 2 treads a lot of the same ground as this documentary and covers it in what I feel a much more concise way.
The parts I found most interesting in this documentary that I really appreciated were all of his reunions with the cast and crew at the various cons. I would have actually enjoyed seeing that whole year, right, that he was on the road.
Yeah, think about, that would have been such an interesting documentary, just a year around with conversations at all these Comic-Cons with Mark Patton.
Yes, because the parts that were really fascinating were his engagements with the community, right? Like the drag community and the way that it's become this show and how he's become a part of the show. Like I think that was what was really interesting, and I would have been on board for more of that. But in the documentary's defense, it's dealing with a text that's really difficult to wrangle because, as we discussed in our episode, is it transgressive or is it homophobic? The short answer is yes, right? It's all of the above, which it more or less describes Nightmare on Elm Street, right? Nightmare on Elm Street as a franchise is all of the above. And that's a hard thing to wrestle with in a relatively short documentary.
So, what do you think? Have you seen Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street? If you have, let us know what you thought of the documentary down below. Be sure to like and subscribe. And, as always, thank you for watching.
And have a spooktacular day.